Okay. Hello, everyone. I can see people is connecting, so very nice to. Hey, Hannah. Hey, Cindy. So many known faces. We're gonna give like 2 more minutes for people to connect, and we will start. And people can choose to keep their cameras working or not working. Feel free to choose whatever you feel more comfortable with. I hope everyone who is in Vancouver, I'm sure is enjoying this glorious sunny day. We have been very lucky. Yeah, so I think I can, okay, I see 15 participants, but I want to make sure that we have time for questions. So I think I'm gonna start like introducing myself and just basically introducing the seminar. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this month, like CSFS Associate Seminars. My name is Laura Morillas, and I am the Research Manager at the Center for Sustainable Food Systems at UBC Farm. And first of all, I would like to begin acknowledging that UBC, the university that we are, most of us, part of, it's located in Vancouver campus, well, the Vancouver campus of UBC, there's one in Okanagan, is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And I also know that right now that we are in this virtual world, many of you might be joining this meeting from other places near and far. And I would also like to invite you to acknowledge and to consider and have a minute to think about who are the caretakers of those lands where you are right now and where you reside. And basically, ask yourself, how are you accountable to those people, the people of those lands? And if you don't know what territories you are on, I'd like to encourage people to find out, do a little bit of research. I am adding right now in the chat a resource that everyone can use to find out what are the traditional caretakers of those lands. Yeah, and I personally feel very grateful and very privileged to live and experience now my life in the Musqueam people lands. So yeah, that's the first thing I always like to start with. And other than that, well, welcome everyone. This seminar, it's organized by the Center for Sustainable Food Systems at UBC Farm. The center is a teaching and research center, as well as a local to global food hub, working towards a more sustainable food secure future. Our mission is to innovate from the field to the fork to achieve a resilient, thriving, and socially just food systems for all. And today's seminar topic is adaptation and mitigation, dual objectives for addressing climate change in diversified agroecosystems. And our wonderful speaker, Dr. Kira Borden, will tell us everything about that, or like the parts that she knows of and the parts that she's working on. And first of all, just a little bit of housekeeping. This is a Zoom meeting, so actually, once we have, like, we estimate the presentation is going to be around 40 minutes, and then we will have 15 minutes for a Q&A section. So as questions arise during the presentation, you can add those questions in the comments in the chat. But at the end of the presentation, in the Q&A session, I most likely will ask you to unmute yourself and ask your own questions, because that's nicer. Yeah, and that's all. Please keep up, like mute your microphones during the presentation, so Kira doesn't suffer any sounds. And yeah, and with all that, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kira Borden. Kira is I would like to say, a good friend of mine. And she's an ENSER postdoctoral fellow in the Faculty of Land and Food Systems, working with the Sustainable Agriculture Landscapes Lab, led by Sean Smokler. She's an agroecologist with expertise in plant functional ecology and biochemistry. And Kira's research is centered on diversified agroecosystems of small and medium-scale farms, producing a range of crops in temperate and tropical regions. Later this year, and that's exciting news, she will be investigating the below-ground mechanisms regulating greenhouse gas emissions from diversified cover crops as a Banting Fellow at the University of Guelph. So congratulations, Kira, for that new position. And yeah, and with that, I think the floor is yours, Kira. You can share your screen and start your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lara. Okay, looks good. Thanks everyone for coming to this seminar. I appreciate you taking your time during a beautiful Tuesday afternoon. Maybe some of you can listen in from outside, or at least with the window open. Yeah, I think Lara, you gave me a great introduction, so I don't really need to give any background on myself, and hopefully my research can speak for itself. Great, and thank you for the land acknowledgement, because I do some research here in Vancouver and on UBC Farm. All right, so I'll start off with kind of a brief introduction on the topic of agriculture and climate change. Many of you probably recognize these tree crops that are shown. On the left is cocoa. So inside those pods are the seeds or the beans that produce chocolate, and on the right is a coffee plant with the cherries and inside the beans that produce delicious coffee. So these two tree crops are tropical crops, and they've been receiving a lot of press recently in regards to how they're going to get impacted by climate change, whether by direct impacts from changing climate, like precipitation and temperature, or floods or drought, or indirect effects from shifting climate and pests and pathogen pressures. And here's some projections of some negative consequences of climate change on coffee in Uganda from UNEP under a 2-degree increase scenario, where we can see dramatic decline in area that it's going to be suitable for coffee growing based on their temperature and their precipitation requirements. And this is a little bit more of a detailed analysis done a few years ago on cocoa, which is a crop that I've done a lot of research on. And we can see at the top, there's large swaths of West Africa that are climatically suitable for cocoa. And it actually is where majority of the cocoa is produced in the world currently. But under our climate change projections, by the year 2050, large areas will become unsuitable for the production of cocoa or for cocoa growth. So we have these direct impacts from climate onto agriculture and how plants can grow in different climates in the future, resulting from different variability in trends in precipitation and temperature. But of course, agriculture has a major role in contributing to anthropogenic climate change because of the emissions of greenhouse gases and losses of carbon to the atmosphere as CO2. And on that note, agriculture is known to have cumulatively contributed 30% of radiative forcing. And I guess from a domestic standpoint, maybe a political standpoint, we've committed to reducing our GHG emissions by 30% for 2030, and that includes within the agriculture sector. So from these two angles of how the climate change impacts agriculture and how agriculture can in turn impact climate, we have these goals of adapting to climate change, whether that be by reducing the negative impacts on our agroecosystems, or from benefiting from new opportunities. And then on the other side, it's how can we reduce the emissions of GHGs or greenhouse gases, so methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide, or reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere through sequestration of carbon. So how does diversified agroecosystems come into this? So these are some study sites that I've worked in, from Ontario along the top. Bottom left is from Ghana, and in the bottom right, many of you, of course, will know that's UBC Farm. And so these systems have a diversity of crops, whether like where crops are being grown or maybe integrated into the landscape. And the idea is that with higher diversity, we can achieve a higher ecosystem. We can achieve higher ecosystem services and function, and I'll get into that a little bit in a second. And then, so with that, like as we achieve, higher ecosystem functions, can that contribute to, climate change adaptation and mitigation? So those are the types of questions, the big picture questions that inform the research that I'm going to give some overview of. So this schematic is, showing a diversified system. We've got different crops, different types of plants, or with different functional attributes. They're growing in one location, or perhaps maybe they're being rotated. And the idea is that they have these different processes going on, and how could they be better than a monoculture system? Well, they could be, there could be some kind of complementary or facilitative interactions that are occurring. So different crops are interacting and accessing different resources. So we can attribute more resource use efficiency to that system. So we call that complementarity effects. Or we're selecting and integrating specific species that can, amplify or can enhance some type of ecological function. So that's a selection effect. So those are kind of the two main pathways that we can achieve a higher ecological performance on a system by diversifying the, the farm or the farming landscape. So I'll start off with a couple examples of some research that I've done on the adaptation side. So my PhD at the University of Toronto with Marnie Isaac as my advisor, I conducted my research in Ghana on cocoa agroforestry systems. And so again, here's just some images of cocoa, Fiambroma cacao, and we've got a bunch of cocoa trees on the left here. And then I took a photo kind of just above the cocoa, canopy, and then you can see a shade tree that's obviously shading the cocoa tree. So cocoa are shade adapted tropical crops, and they can do well under shade systems. So they're already inclined towards these more like diversified systems. And my work specifically focused on what was going on below ground. So in this study that I'm going to describe to you, we looked at the root systems of cocoa to see how they're acquiring resources from soil. And so these crops, they're grown by small scale farms or farmers, and they don't usually use a lot of inputs. There's no irrigation generally. So really understanding how the crops are acquiring resources makes some direct links to how well the crop is going to perform. And I went across these different sites. So you can actually see this is, a bit blurry, but you can see where the green is. That's obviously where there's high rates of or higher precipitation, more vegetation, more productivity. And it's in that area actually that cocoa is grown quite, I guess there's a lot of cocoa being grown in Ghana is what I'm trying to say. And I picked areas that were kind of well within that cocoa growing region. So they're meeting the climatic requirements of cocoa, as well as a couple that are up here towards what we call the transition zone. So it's getting closer to the savanna and it's much drier. So this kind of summarizes that sampling scheme that I just described. So it's looking at cocoa trees that are in that climatically optimal range. and then those that are getting closer to the transition zone in the north that are in the suboptimal precipitation range. And then within that theme, there was 2 different soil types. Sorry, I have a 5-month-old right now, so I have a bit of a baby brain. So you might catch me a few times realizing that I've just forgotten to say something. So there's within the 2 climatic zones, we have different types of soil. So the idea is trying to get a little bit more nuanced information about how cocoa are responding to climate based on some of the underlying growing conditions that they're on, the soil properties. So we've got sandy and loam conditions. And then within each of those sites, areas where cocoa are grown monoculture versus those that are grown with terminally Ivarensis, which is this really big and commonly used timber species that are used for shade in cocoa agroforestry in Ghana. And here, myself, obviously in the bottom right, and then 2 colleagues, research assistants that I hired from Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology from Kumasi in Ghana. They were great, and they helped me do these very labor-intensive excavations of the roots. The idea was we had to, locate roots that were directly attached to specific cocoa trees. So this is pretty, as you can see, back-aching work. And from those samples, we conducted some analyses on their morphology and chemical attributes that can tell us something about how they're acquiring resources from the soil. And using those data, we looked at, okay, so how are they performing across different sites and with different management treatments. And so our analyses revealed that it's very context specific of how agroforestry practices can modify how cocoa are going to be acquiring resources from soil. So it's more in these suboptimal conditions, and specifically in loam soil, that we really saw a strong response of cocoa to being grown in agroforestry or being grown in monoculture. And so this can have implications of choosing shade tree species for adaptation purposes. And then I guess also it's conceptually, or it's very practical to think about tree crops, because farmers are going to invest in them for 20 years. And so, the climate that they grow them in now is going to be vastly different, or could be vastly different in 20 years from now. So the whole time scale of climate change is very real for cocoa farmers and other farmers who work with tree crops. And other researchers have done fantastic work looking at how much knowledge, or the knowledge that farmers have, and they already are selecting shade trees that are conducive or that are good for their respective climates. But of course, as that changes, they need new practices to adopt. And so knowing that there's these context specific requirements, like maybe you need to consider the soil texture when you decide on if a specific shade tree is going to be good in the future. Those are the type of information that this type of research would help to inform. So then if we shifting continents, this is the work that I've been working on at UBC Farm. So we're looking now at sort of mixed vegetable farms or organic vegetable farms in BC. These are small, medium scale farms and that are growing a diversity of crops over different years, or as you can see at the same time, we've got different brassica species growing together, cabbage and kale and cauliflower. And so for this research that's been initiated, I guess, a year ago, 2 years ago, we set up this experiment to see how overwinter precipitation can be better managed on these farms. So it's expected that there's going to be more precipitation in the area on the shoulder seasons, so in the spring and the fall. And so this makes managing these farms a little bit more challenging. And so looking at cover cropping systems or plastic mulch as a way to regulate soil moisture is the broad objective of this research. And I've listed the main researchers that are involved in this project. And so that you can see on the top, that's precipitation over the year, where these big bars of blue of our high precipitation events occurring predominantly in the winter months. And on the bottom is the effect of our treatments on the soil moisture conditions under cover cropping or plastic mulch. So these are very preliminary results, just kind of characterizing how our treatments are impacting the soil environment for these crops. And I've got a mountain of data that are waiting for me when I return from mat leave. But I guess one of the interesting angles of this is that there's also at the same time this nutrient management, we're evaluating nutrient management practices as well. So organic farmers, have lots of decisions to make, including how are they going to meet the nutrient requirements of crops, and that ensures that they're organically certified and building good organic matter in the soil, etc. So these pictures show some nutrient management trials or treatments being applied to the same sites. And we're seeing some interesting interactions between our soil management treatments and the nutrient management treatments that are in place. And so I'm looking forward to kind of digging into that. And it kind of ties back to the other study in that, there are these interactions between the soil conditions and these management practices in terms of soil moisture and potentially nutrients and how crops are going to be acquiring those nutrients. So the on-farm challenges, just again highlighting that, these small scale, medium scale farms are challenged with these high precipitation shoulder seasons, or increasingly so into the future. And that they're also, they have lots of constraints around, they have to make decisions of can they establish cover crops, what crops are they going to grow the subsequent year, they're rotating crops, there's a mixture of crops, which makes it very difficult to prescribe, a single type of management. And then there's these potentials for interactions between soil moisture management and nutrient management practices. So now shifting to the mitigation side. And so for this, there's kind of two angles here. The one is to sequester atmospheric carbon. And so the first study that I'm going to describe really focuses on that and how carbon is stored into crop biomass or tree biomass on a farm. And then the next one, or the subsequent studies, I'll talk about the emissions of greenhouse gases from soil. So back to Ghana and our cocoa agroforestry systems. Obviously, if you're growing trees in these larger shade trees in a cocoa system, you're going to expect that you're going to have more biomass carbon that's stored in those trays, right? So you would see that as a carbon sink more so than a monoculture system where it's just cocoa. But of course, we lack data on what that, what those gains are, and the nuances of what happens when you plant different types of species together, or what type of mixtures can be optimal for that type of mitigation objective. So this picture, you've got the Ambroma cacao and two different shade trees that are common to West Africa. The terminalia, which we already talked about, that really big shade tree, it's semi-deciduous, and then the Enterdiaphragma angolense, much different type of canopy structure, a little bit more sparser. It's slower growing, a hardwood species. So they have these different functional attributes as well, the different shade trees. So here's some results from a study where we estimated how much carbon is in the biomass of these different systems. So monoculture, I overlaid it with the totals here. Monoculture obviously has lower, but then we have these two forms of agroforestry. So cocoa integrated with that slower growing hardwood Enterdiaphragma angolense versus cocoa integrated with those very fast growing pioneer species, the Terminalia Ivarensis. So really no surprises in the results, but it's great to have these types of carbon data for these inventories. I guess one of the interesting sort of ecological outcomes of this research, however, shows that based on whichever agroforestry practice the cocoa were growing in, they actually allocated biomass differently. So normally what we do is we go into, to tabulate how much biomass and carbon, you'd go in and you'd use these allometric equations. So you can measure the diameter at breast height, you can look at the tree height, and we have these equations that tell us, that can estimate the volume of wood that's there, and we can apply a conversion to carbon. But what we found was that these allometric equations were not that reliable for cocoa, based on whether they're being planted in monoculture or planted in an agroforestry system. So they're growing differently. They're growing more roots in the agroforestry system. So this is kind of a, these boxes here. So the higher the median is actually, the higher the root to shoot ratio. So more roots versus above ground biomass. And there's a lot of variability, as well as if you compare it to what, the IPCC or average amounts that would be calculated by allometric equations, there's some, missed differences that conventional methods lead to. So like I said, as you expected, there's more carbon in agroforestry systems, but there is some nuance there, and conventional methods might miss these differences. So on a farm scale, these differences might be small, maybe a ton of carbon difference. But then you start to extrapolate that to that there being 1.6 million hectares of cocoa cultivation in Ghana, and you start to see that, if there's any kind of systematic variation occurring, that it can lead to these large differences in how we're accounting for carbon. Okay, so then that was the carbon sequestration side. Flipping to the emission side of mitigation. This work that I'm going to start with, it's back in Ontario, and we were looking at, so this is part of an agriculture greenhouse gases program project that I was involved in with the University of Guelph and University of Toronto. And we focused on riparian buffers in the Guelph area. And so these buffer systems, as many of us already know, are ways to mitigate impacts from agriculture. So in the case here, it's intensive corn and soybean rotation in Ontario. So mitigate the impacts of nutrients leaching into waterways and to stream banks. It's a source of additional biodiversity, microclimate regulation of the stream. There's many ecological benefits to these. But there's not much known about what type of impact they might have on the mitigation capacity of our landscapes. And we really, for this work, dived into the nitty-gritty of what's driving CO2 emissions from soil. So soil respiration is a function of basically two components: what's coming from autotrophic respiration below ground, so root respiration, and what's coming from heterotrophic respiration. And so we wanted to understand, we looked at different types of riparian systems and wanted to understand, well, what's contributing to overall soil respiration rate? Is there a way to understand the drive, the main factors and what's driving CO2 respiration and this carbon flux to the atmosphere? So I'm not a soil microbiologist, so we worked with soil microbiologists to answer these types of questions. We set up these root exclusion experiments in order to try and, there's limits, but it's a way to try and tease apart carbon dioxide that's coming from roots versus what's coming from autotrophic respiration from the microbes in soil. And so these data are the 4 different types of riparian buffers that we worked in: a grassland buffer, a rehabilitated tree buffer, and then some older growth buffers that featured coniferous trees, or was more of a mixture. And so we have these flex data from different sources, autotrophic versus heterotrophic, and we can relate that to microbial analysis that was done, as well as other properties like the type of roots that were there. And so I do a lot of functional trait work, and so I related that to these respiration rates as well as the soil properties that were there. So I won't go into too much detail on that, but I'm happy to answer questions on that. On the left are some results from the study that focused on those, how to link soil properties with root properties and microbial properties. And we saw these kind of systematic patterns across different types of riparian buffers. And then on the right are some results from a study that's being under review right now that's led by a soil microbiologist at Guelph, looking at the effects of these root exclusion experiments on interkingdom interactions. So your fungi, archaea, and bacteria co-occurrences. At UBC Farm, this is some work, another collaborative project brought through the Agriculture Greenhouse Gases program. So I can see Andy Black is here. So him and the Biomet group, among other soil scientists, are involved in this work. We can see Carson Lee and Morgan Hamilton working in the field. And we've established these auto chambers. So these big domes that close down onto those larger collars, as well as manual collars that are just aside to them. And they, as they're closed, they accumulate the greenhouse gases, methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide. And over time, you can plot the rate of emissions based on how they accumulate over time. So the auto chambers, they collect the data continuously, or kind of continuously throughout the day and the night. And the manual chambers, Morgan's out there obviously manually closing a chamber and taking measurements with a gas met. So we've got a lot of data coming from the site where we've done these treatments of plastic mulch and cover cropping and different nutrient management strategies to see how these all interact and how they impact emissions. So again, a ton of data. We're hoping to do some modeling on this since we have multiple years of data to parameterize some commonly used carbon nitrogen models. Here's some more images of the auto chambers in the field and after the tarps have been removed. And some preliminary data of the greenhouse gas emissions from the, following different nutrient management strategies. So on the bottom are these instantaneous fluxes that are occurring. And if you add them up over time, we see that, treatments where we're piling on a lot of compost are emitting cumulatively more nitrous oxide emissions over time. And another lovely photo taken by Carson Lee, the tech of our group. Just to go back, or I guess to think about long-term effects. So, we're modifying the soil, not just with what we're amending, but, the cover crops that are growing, that's a source of carbon. So what happens to that in the long term? And so I guess just ending on this beautiful photo of UBC Farm is where I want to go. Yeah, so the final, I guess the big three takeaway messages from what I wanted to share today. From the adaptation side, that interactions between climate and soil properties can impact the success of a management practice, a diversification practice. From the mitigation side, systematic variation from diversification can lead to these larger differences for our regional scale assessments of how much carbon is being sequestered or stored. And then finally, the importance of below ground ecology. So a lot of my work, as you can see, revolves around what's going on below ground with the roots and soil. And I work a lot with microbiologists. And those are main driving forces of what's occurring that's driving greenhouse gas emissions from the soil. So yeah, but we don't know a lot because it's very difficult to study and complex. So I think it's exciting times to be involved in this type of research. And with that, just a thank you to everyone that's helped me out in the field and in the lab, and some funding sponsors, of course, along the way. So I'm happy to take some questions and have a discussion, hopefully.
Thank you so much, Kira. Yeah, thank you, everyone. I have a question, but I would like to see if others have questions. So please, like, if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand, and the raising hand, you can find the raise hand button in the reactions section. Okay, Hannah has a question. So Hannah, I'm gonna ask the first question and then you go, because I'm very curious. You show, Kira, the cumulative effect of the different management practices at UBC Farm. Could you share your presentation again? And it was you didn't describe what the different treatments were, but I saw that there was a huge difference between the typical, which, yeah, if you look at the top window, the control is red, and it's obviously doing much better in terms of emissions in compared with the typical. So could you explain what was the control and what was the typical management practice that you were comparing there?
Yes, so control is when we're not applying anything. And the typical is what the farm typical application rate would be. So to measure that, we actually went out with tarps, and Tim or whoever had been managing that plot at the time would just drive a tractor over, and we'd weigh how much compost that they dumped onto a certain area, and we could estimate, how much compost per area that they're applying. And it actually corresponded very closely with our target N, is how we've labeled it here. It's a high compost application where we're exclusively using compost to meet the nutrient demands or the nitrogen demands of crops. And to do so, you have to put quite a bit of compost on, because that not all of that nitrogen that you're putting on is going to be available for plants. It has to mineralize first. It takes time. So you put quite a bit of compost on to do that, to meet the nitrogen demand. So the typical and the target N, which are the purple and the green lines at the top there, that's a lot of compost being put on. And if you could go back in your mind, if I could show you a photo. These areas where you see a lot of compost, that's what I mean by quite a bit of compost being put on.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. I was curious. Okay, so Hannah, you go next. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Great, thanks, Kira. I'm not sure how I missed the boat that you were Marnie Isaac's student. That's so funny. I didn't realize that. But yeah, congratulations. This is a huge body of work and very impressive. I have a couple two unrelated questions, but coming from the side of kind of farmer-driven research, and then also thinking about the applicability of some of this to farmers' real lives. And one of the things that we're finding a lot is that diversification brings a lot of social and economic challenges. Like because of its labor intensiveness, because of the additional layers of knowledge that are needed, the more crops that you're managing and the more you're kind of mixing them up in different ways, there's different kinds of knowledge that are needed, and it's just a more intense system. So I guess my first question, and then I'll ask the second one maybe after everyone else has had a chance to go, is to what extent are you guys studying the labor implications of diversification and kind of including that in your cost benefit analysis?
Yeah, so that is that's an excellent question. And that is getting included in the analysis for UBC Farm work, since we have the cost of the inputs. So that's one indicator of, you know, I guess the economic input. In terms of
the physical, but not just the inputs themselves, but the labor to apply them and harvest and manage and all that, that kind of labor.
So I guess in terms of, if you were to relate labor of comparing a monoculture versus a mixture of crops, that's definitely not part of the data that we'd be collecting. That would be very interesting to have that kind of gradient of diversification and see the labor requirements along that gradient. But these are all, I think I saw Amy Norgard on here. She did the regional analysis, and Relani Kessler is doing the regional analysis. So they worked on small farms, and they, with various different crops. So I don't know if the labor could be really quantified from the data that they have. From UBC Farm, that's anyone's more than welcome to chime in on that from the UBC
Yeah,
group.
I think they were trying to track it at UBC Farm, but I guess it's more a bigger question just from your research and these other contexts as well. To what extent did farmers talk about the labor being a constraint or not to diversification?
I can add to that, Kira, of just like mentioning the regional studies. It was something that we wanted to include because there is a difference between like hand spreading or being able to very easily spread like feather meal fertilizer versus like spreading manure or compost. And yeah, it was too difficult for our study, so we didn't include it. But yeah, it is a good point.
But I guess, yeah, so that's certainly, yeah, right, for the different types of amendment strategies that a farmer could implement. But I mean, even us trying to target the correct amount, it's very difficult to figure out the best strategy to do that, because you've got underlying soil characteristics, different climate properties, and then once you start overlaying different crops that you're planting, then that have different histories or different, you know, site history, it becomes very difficult to know exactly how much compost or feather meal you're going to apply. So that's where trying to come up with some easier ways to do that is part of the research that this is kind of addressing, by targeting, you know, taking more of a blanket approach of, okay, so what's going to come off in harvestable biomass, then that's the amount of nutrients that we're going to target, regardless of what's in the soil. So it's, I guess, one easier way for a farmer to manage complexity.
Yeah,
that's
great. And then I just, on that last point, you talked about the future directions and the below ground ecology, which I just find fascinating. And again, looking from a farmer perspective, are there ways for farmers to get involved in more self-assessment of soil health? And I was just curious, kind of any ideas you have about, you know, especially farmers who may have fewer economic resources, you know, if they can't run around sending soil samples to the lab all the time. What are some ways that you've found that farmers can kind of self-assess soil health in a way that maps onto or approximates the kind of estimates that you're able to get with these like amazing pieces of equipment?
Yeah. So I suppose an easy one that farmers would identify already in cocoa systems is mycorrhizal association. So cocoa do form mycorrhizal associations, and you can see it. It's a very visual indicator of that process happening. And you know, there's some work looking at, you know, are there more associations in monoculture versus more diversified systems, or the other way around. Yeah, so that's one kind of visual, easy indicator that a farmer could use without having to send soil samples away. But yeah, I mean, that being said,
just for perennial crops, or would that work for annual crops too?
Yeah, you could use it for annual crops. I mean, the brassica, it depends on the crop. Brassicas generally don't form mycorrhizal associations. Others are more, might have that. like a grass type of species or forages might show that type of process happening. That being said, you know, analyzing soil for the DNA profiles of microbes in soil is becoming increasingly more accessible. So it could become something more accessible for other farmers too.
Oh,
yeah, thank you so much, Hannah. I don't know, like, is anyone else thinking of any questions? And they are being shy. I just want to. Okay, Amy has a question. Amy, go ahead.
Great. Great presentation, Kira. It's really interesting to see like the vegetable, I guess, research in the same presentation as like the cocoa. My question is for the same that same graph that Laura was looking at earlier, the GHG emissions from the different treatments. So it kind of seems like you're finding basically what Gabriel was finding as well, is like we have these high N2O emissions from like high compost or manure applications. But then I also feel like he was finding like a yield trade-off with that. I'm not too sure if you've looked at your yield data yet, but is it following kind of like Gabriel's pattern of, so like you're having the high N2O emissions from those treatments, but those treatments are also yielding slightly higher than the other ones?
Yeah, I think you may have seen some of the yield data at one of the conferences we've presented at, but yeah, there are no differences among the different treatments. So there's more yield than when you're not applying anything, no surprise. But so yeah, there's no, from the initial data set that I've worked with so far, we haven't seen that type of trade-off in yield output among the different strategies yet.
Sweet. Yeah, I feel like that's what I remembered seeing. I just wasn't too sure if those were like super preliminary results or if that was starting to be a more complete data set, but it sounds like you're still.
Yeah, I haven't looked too in depth at where they've tracked for from last summer. I haven't looked at that data set yet, but. Yeah.
Sweet, thank you.
Andy Black is just like very happy with the results. Yeah, so Andy, do you have any particular questions? And Amy,
yes,
you can,
yeah.
There you go, Andy, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. Yeah, it's very interesting to look at the cocoa shade system, and I was wondering how old is a plantation like that? Is it 20 years old? I don't have any idea. And does everything get planted at the same time? I mean, what I'm getting at here is the amount of carbon that you see in that stand, like the above ground, that's accumulated over the life of the plantation, right? So you divide your numbers by age, and you have a rough approximation of the rate of carbon sequestration, right, in tons of carbon per hectare per year. And I was just wondering if you thought about that. I mean, I'm also interested in what's happening in the soil in terms of carbon. Is it declining? You accumulate in the above ground. What's happening in the soil, do you think?
Yeah, so for the age of the plantations, cocoa starts producing cocoa pods around 5 years into their lifespan. And then the varieties that are commonly used, like the main ones that are relied on in Ghana, probably a 20-25 year lifespan. Some other varieties do go for a lot longer. They'll go for 50 years, which is pretty neat. But yeah, there's certainly, I mean, it's a bit of a, I don't know if I want to say can of worms, but it feels like a can of worms when we start talking about carbon storage temporally in forest systems or forest-like systems. You've got these shade trees. Some of them are going to be cut down sooner than others. So fast-growing terminalia species that's used for timber might get harvested sooner but it also, that would be used for lumber, likely. So yeah, about 20, 25 years is the lifespan. Yeah, and then they would get planted all together. Shade trees, cocoa. Sometimes if it's a shade tree might already be there and cocoa get planted underneath. So that would be the other pathway.
In some of our forest systems here, we'll see lots of carbon sequestration above ground, right? Big trees are growing, but in the soil, we'll even see declines in the amount of carbon there. So you're paying a high price for that accumulation above ground that eventually goes off to the mill or wherever it goes.
Yeah. Yeah, there's certainly, it's very complex because even the shade trees, they're going to have different litter types. And so they're going to drive different types of nutrient cycling in the soil.
Yeah.
But yeah, these are all questions that get asked in much of the research of cocoa agroforestry and related to carbon. And then there's lots of context-specific results that say, yes, there's more carbon, and some, no, there's no gains in carbon in the soil with agroforestry. It depends, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Kira, that's good.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question, Kira, about that. And in the meantime, if anyone has an additional question, please raise your hand and I will allow you to ask the question. But yeah, about the cocoa. So you basically were looking at 3 factors, right? Like growing cocoa by itself without the agroforestry, kind of like the diversified model, and then like growing. And that was shaded or not shaded, right? That was the factor. And then you also had the type of soil. And what else? I think you had like 3 different things that you were looking at. And I just want to, yeah, there you go. So, and then you also had like 2 different types of shading trees. Is that correct?
For this climate gradient study, I focused exclusively on one shade tree. So I controlled for shade tree effect by looking at one specific species.
I was curious I think it's a few slides after that, basically what was the system that was working better, and particularly in the suboptimal sites. You mentioned that you were looking at like very great conditions to grow this agroforestry system, but then going into the suboptimal sites, like closer to the savanna. I'm curious about that kind of analysis. I imagine you look at these suboptimal locations as a way of mimicking like potential climate change conditions. Am I right?
Yeah, I guess I should have said that. Yeah, so the climate gradient, we've got these suboptimal locations, and more, I think it's nearly half of what's currently optimal is going to shift into the suboptimal category of cocoa cultivation in the next few decades.
And so, what was the system that worked better based on your analysis in those suboptimal conditions to grow cocoa?
So I don't want to say which works better, but that we identified sort of a way to first use some sort of repeatable, measurable attribute. So these functional traits that we're measuring as a way to indicate what's happening more systematically across these different gradients: soil, climate, and species diversification. Of course, you'd want to know what yield the yield response is, but that data is very difficult to get. I won't go into the challenges on that, but there's trade-offs. So maybe you don't want to grow something that's very fast growing in a drier condition. I know farmers prefer to have maybe fruit-bearing trees so that they can diversify their income and food sources in more drier conditions. whereas in more optimal conditions, a farmer could implement these fast-growing carbon sequestering trees more readily. So there's some I guess different decision making that would get implemented.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so I'm trying to connect your previous slide where you show the different results from the different those different factors. Yeah, that one. I'm trying to like.
Which is better?
Yeah, is this in any way answering, like in terms of at least in terms of carbon sequestration? Yeah, I'm a little bit puzzled with this figure because you pass by fast, and I'm just trying to understand this figure a little bit better. What was your learning from this figure?
That is under certain conditions that this particular shade tree actually has an effect on cocoa nutrient acquisition strategies or soil resource acquisition strategies. Okay. And so it could impact for negative or worse. What that is, that requires a little bit more of a specific long-term study, but it's kind of identifying that it's only under certain conditions that it has that type of impact. And this particular fast-growing shade tree species. Does that? Yeah,
I think I understand this now better. Okay, yeah, it sounds very interesting and such a different systems that you have been working on, Ghana and Vancouver. It's amazing. So, well, I think if no one else has any additional questions, and I see people is already thanking you, I think we can wrap up. Thank you so much, Kira. It was wonderful to have you back. I know you have been busy with other more like life important things like growing a baby. So congratulations on that as well. So thank you so much for bringing these results and this body of research. And yeah, behind the scenes, I would like to also thank Melanie Kuxdorf that was helping me with the technical details. And please join us for our next CSFS Associate Seminar that will be on June 14th. And we will have Dr. Simone Castellarin telling us about his research in wine and berries and climate adaptation. So yeah, I will send emails with more information and registration links for that one, but keep posted. And yeah, and thank you everyone. Have a lovely day. If you have a chance, go out, and you, Kira, particularly, have a break. Take your baby and go for a walk.
I already have. Thank you. See you.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.